knows who we've got up front. Would you like to go through and just say who you are? Maybe if you don't mind your age. And
oh, this will be good.
Oh, that's a bad question.
No worries at all.
it's loaded.
No, actually my grandfather came from Nottingham. I think he must have been probably related to Robin Hood, but I don't know. But anyway, he wanted to see the world, so he joined a ship. He only wanted to see the world in the back in the early 1800s to go on a ship. So he was in the lace trade, but he got bored him to death. So he thought he'd go and see the world. So he sailed around the world. I think when he was 16, he went on a boat, and when he sailed around Cape Horn a few times. Anyway, when he got to Adelaide in 1920, he and his mate decided that this is the best place they'd seen around the world, actually. So they jumped their ship. So I'm descended from an illegal immigrant. So anyway, as Kim said, I'm 84. I was born at Lenswood, actually. No, I'm sorry. I was born at Loberthal, but it was called Tweedville in those days because of the anti-German feeling. So my passport said I was born at Tweedville. Nobody knows where it is because it's Loberthal now, because that was anti-German feeling after the First World War. I've been in the fruit industry. I tell people I've lived my life in preventative medicine, you know, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But it was really worthwhile. I really enjoyed my years as an apple grower. Now, of course, my wife there, she came from Adelaide actually, poor girl, she had to get adjusted country life. And she used to work in Rundlestick, but she adjusted to country life. She was one of my best pickers. Anyway, we have two children. Janita, she's in Brisbane now, and our son sold the orchard about 15 years ago, and he's down there. He runs Black Angus cattle down at Keith. So that's a very brief history of my life. But I've enjoyed my life, and every day is a wonderful day. We still enjoy life.
A little bit like Kelvin's. I've been apple grower all my life. That's what I've got to count right now. Great grandpa come from England, as far as I know, more or less the centre of London. He was a bootmaker, and he used to make up his boots, come to Forest. He was in the city for a little while, then he come to Forest Range. You know the district at all, it's roughly where Roger Flavel lives right now, took up land there. He made his boots, walked to town, sold them, bought his leather and what other else he wanted, probably some groceries. His kids used to walk down to as far as Deep Creek to meet him on the way home, help him carry the stuff. I'm not sure how many children, not very many children. And his son James, they had 12 children. One little girl at the age of 8 got drowned in the well, unfortunately. But Frank, one of the boys, became my grandfather. And he married a Collins, so this ties up the district pretty well. And further down the track, my father married a Green, so look out, there's Masons, Greens, Collinses, you just be careful what you say. Yeah. Yes. So, in due course, after the mining, gold mining went flat, there was a number of blocks up in the area where we are, on the northwest side of the Loberthal Road at Forest Range, what they call the mining blocks, come up for sale. And my dad, he was 18 at the time, he said to his dad, I've got a block picked out, can you help me get it? So Dad started on that block in, 1913, when he was 18. Virgin scrub, big stringy barks, and I don't know how he done it, but he cut out a property, and how he existed while he was getting things organised, I'm not sure. But anyway, he survived. And he married my mum, Myra Green. We saw the old house opposite the post office at Lenswood. That's where my mum grew up. Then Mum married in the little church that's on the questionnaire up by Colin and Margaret Fly. They was married there in 1922, I think it was. So in due course there was 4 of us children. I'm the youngest, and of course I went to the Lenswood well, it was the forest school in my days, and we had these pet shows once a year, which was a pretty good event. Mrs. Playford often opened them, and it was very much on the same level as the Royal Adelaide Show. It was about as significant for this district anyway. It had fruit and vegetables and content, you know, the sections and prizes, and they was judged by notable people and the pets, of course. And I think that most entries got a prize, you know, so that no child was whatever disappointed. And yeah, it's. I understand the road through to Laberthal was, from a dirt track, was sealed in about 31. And the kids going to school was dead scared of the steamrollers. They thought they was from another world. That was pretty frightening. But as far as transport's concerned, right up until 1950, there was one fella, Arnold East, or known as Mate East, was still going to the market with his 2 horses and his trolley. We'd be going home from school about 3:30 or 4 o'clock, and here his mate's on his way to market. And 24 hours later, when we was going home from school, we'd meet him. He was just getting back home. So that was, I would say, quite an ordeal to go to market under those conditions. So the transport's come a long way since then. We'll not leave it at that.
Excuse me, chaps. Well, my name's Dean Rowley. I'm the baby amongst the group of chaps here. I'm only 76. I'm a 4th generation in my family to grow apples in this part of the world. My great-great-grandfather came out from Somerset in England in 1840 on a sailing ship which took them 3.5 months to get here. They eventually settled in Adelaide and later on moved up into the hills to a place called Stone Hut. Do any of you know where Stone Hut is? It's down over the Alps, as we call them. And he and his family lived there. And grandfather actually walked from Stone Hut to Jerry's Flat School when he started school. And Mrs. Fry, who was the principal's wife, took pity on him and suggested that he should sleep and eat at their place during the week. Therefore, he only had to walk up from Stone Hut on Mondays and back on Fridays. Later on, he bought, or he leased, 90 acres of land off the old Givendale property. You'd all be familiar with Fred's Tank just down the road. That was part of it. Trevannans and Joneses also had a part of the Givendale property. He came there when he was first married in 1903. The only improvements on the place at that stage were 2 slab huts, one of which was there till quite recently. In 1908, he purchased 90 acres that he had leased from the proprietors, which were an English company which had given the land grant, I believe, before they even left England. And that 90 acres eventually became the property of my Uncle Fred Rowland at Fred's Tank. My father, whose property was in the corner of Collins Road and Steniford Road, and Mr. Les, what's his name? Just next door. Les Collins. Les Collins, that's right. That was originally part of my grandfather's early purchase. As I say, I grew up working on my father's property. Later went to work for Mr. Brian Vegas. We won't want any stories about those years, thank you, Brian. Decided that Lenswood wasn't the place for me, so I got a job at Paracombe, managing a 120-acre orchard over there, where my wife and I grew the fruit. My wife packed it and I marketed in the East End market for 10 years. After which I gave that away and came back to manage the packing shed at Lenswood Colour. That only lasted for about 4 years, and I left the district and got a job as abattoirs manager for Golden Poultry Farming Industries. A job which involved killing about 20,000 chooks a day, 5 days a week, and processing and disposing of the product of that abattoir. I stuck there for 10 years, and the last 10 years of my working life I got into the drug trade. I became a distributor of cigarettes for Philip Morris and WD&H Wells. I was employed by Main Nicholas, who were a large transport company in those days. Another chap from Melbourne and I were employed to establish a brand new distribution network through the whole of Australia. I later became responsible for the Western Division, which included South Australia, Northern Territory and Western Australia. And on behalf of our clients, we used to warehouse their products of cigarettes and tobacco. They would take orders over the phone today, and our responsibility was to deliver those orders to the customers tomorrow. Now, whether that was in Whyalla or Broken Hill or Adelaide. Our brief was that if we got an order today, by whatever means we could establish, we had to deliver that to the customer tomorrow and collect and bank the proceeds for the contracting company. After 10 years of that, I decided it was time to give it away, and we now live at Woodside, where we've recently moved into a retirement village there and finding life very, very exciting. Thank you.
My name is Brian Biggers. I spent quite a bit of my life here in Lenswood. In October it'll be 18 years since I left here. I live at Roslyn Park in Adelaide now. I'd just like to say not much about my family. Kelvin and I got the same backgrounds. But before I left Lenswood, when the Lenswood Cold Stores was 50 years old, we asked the shareholders if we could write up the history of the cold store, and they voted $2,000 to write it up. I had an ulterior motive to write up the history of Forest Range and Lenswood, and we changed it a little. And what I wish to say today is thank you to you people coming, thanks for the people who organised this, but special thanks to all the people that were third generation in this family when we were writing that book, and all the information they gave us. And that's people like Marilyn Green's here, and you were here, Ken, your grandfather, Arthur Green, Fred Rowley, your grandfather, Dean, Bert Copeland, no Copeland's here. And these people, Manx speakers, they all wrote up a lot of things for us. Stan Green, any of Albert Green's descendants here, no. But Stan Green, at the age of 82, wrote me 13 pages on the history of exporting apples in his handwriting. And I've still got it. I gave it to his grandchildren, or his children rather, a few months ago. We photostated off, and they seem to be thrilled to get it. Then there was another book, and that book is still available from Lenswood Cold Stores. My wife named it, it's called Stringy Bark Orchards. Now, we did a history of the Agriculture Bureau, which is a self-help agricultural committee helping farmers who get together and have guest speakers and talk about their experiences. And when that was 100 years old, we wrote the history of that up. Fortunately, we had a full set of minutes for the 100 years. And I did 60 years and Kelvin did 40, and Carol Brockhoff wrote the book for us. And I forgot to tell you, Stringy Bark Orchards, we paid Jeffrey Bishop $10,000 to write that book. And we had several committees here in Lenswood getting information. And the day we launched it, we'd spent $27,000 and we'd been allocated $2,000. And I'm very pleased to say in 10 days we were in credit. We sold that many books. We had a big show at the Lenswood Cold Stores, opened some new rooms, and we had the Premier, John Bannon, up to do it. He's the Premier of the day, had always done the big things at Lenswood Cold Stores. So we got John Bannon, about 1,030 people there. for afternoon tea, and the Ladies Bowling Club did afternoon tea for us, and it was a marvellous day. And Stringy Barks Orchard just went, and they did a reprint a couple of years ago, and it's still available, and most of the information that we can give you today is in that book. Thank you very much.
That undertaking was probably a landmark for this district, and the history that was in that book was absolutely fantastic. And at the right time, when, as you said, a lot of the guys were in their 80s, not long after many of them had passed away, the information that was gleaned from them is something that we really hold fondly.
Very valuable.
Yes, well, I didn't go into detail, but it was the right time to write that book because, as I said, we had quite a few people still alive. As I said, Stan Green was 82. That was the third generation. Now, you've got some people here today of the first generation. In this district, there was two very important people came here very early. They had married sisters. One was John Brock Fry, and one was Henry Green, your great-great-grandfathers. And they were sawyers. In those days, you dug a trench in the ground, you rolled a log over it, and one man with a very broad-brimmed hat was down underneath in the trench pulling a saw down. Another man was standing up on the log and he pulled the saw up. It only sawed on the downstroke, so the sawdust came down on the man underneath. That's why you have a broad hat. They were both. They married sisters from Galway, and their father-in-law had a timber licence to go into Crown land and get timber. And these two gentlemen sorted out for the buildings in Adelaide in those days. Now, John Brock Fry hurt his back. He must have been rolling a log. So he did a crash course in school teaching, and they made him school teacher. And he stayed there for 29 years, and in some families he taught three generations. And that was your great-great-grandfather. They built two slab houses just below where the Lenswood coal stores were. In the creek there was a spring there, so they built two slab houses there, and that's where they started. And John Brock Fry brought land north, and Henry Green brought land south from there. And as their daughters and sons got married, they gave them a block of land. And John Brock Fry only had one son, I think, and he's about 4 daughters. And Alec Brockoff married the first daughter. That's the first orchard on the left up the Cold Store Road. Dickie Townsend married another one, that's Townsend's on the other side. And Harry Caldicott married another one, that's over the other side. And as they got married, John Brock Fry gave them some land. And the same thing happened with the Greens. You had Robert Green, you had Harry Green, which is your great-great-grandfather. You had Albert Green up by the cold store, you had George Green on top of the hill opposite the school, and you had William Green, the first one on the left down the Swamp Road. I'll tell you a little story about William Green. He was the only person I knew in the district that had a black horse. We all had Clydesdale Bay horses, and William Green had a black horse. As we were walking to school, we'd always see this black horse. And my older daughter wrote up my history a while ago, and my writing can't be too good, but she said one New Year's Eve we painted Will Green's house white, but it was his black horse we painted white.
42 families of Greens at one stage.
So, thanks for that. Ladies at the back, would you like to...
That was a follow.
I'm not going to stand up. I'm Topsy Riley Marybridge. I was born in Murray Bridge. We lived at Borrica, which is the other side of Karoonda. My father had a farm growing wheat and sheep, and when I was 6 he decided to come to Lenswood to live. So for our kids' education, I had 2 older sisters and a younger brother. And we lived in Lenswood. We went to the Lenswood school, and then I went to Oakbank on the bus they called Bertha, which had so much gaps in it that all the dust came in, and we left home in a green uniform and we got to school in a brown one. When I left school I went to work in Adelaide, and then I met up with Dean, and he was happy to take me along, and I married Dean, and most of my life since then has been looking after him.
And she's done it well.
You haven't finished.
Yes, I have. Short life, mate, I'm the youngest.
Mark?
Well, I've been told not to talk too much. I've got 2 daughters here and they're very grumpy with me because I talked too much before. So anyway, I was born at Tweedale, Lowenthal, to Jack and Alma Trevelyan, and we lived at Gibbondale down the Swamp Road. Wonderful neighbours next door, Brockoffs and Joneses, and we walked to school at 5, and then Mr. and Mrs. Baum, they gave us a bike each, Phil and I. Well, that was good, so we rode from then on. I went to Oakbank in year 5, caught the bus, changed schools, and I went there until in the 2nd year. Came home, Mum wasn't well, and I helped with her for a while. She got on right after. And picked apples, and we planted everything in between apples. You had tomatoes, everything. Anyway, I did that, and then what happened? Dad took over running Baum's property, Dad and Phil, so we moved up to what was built for the workman's cottage, and that, and then I married Bob Fry, and then we went to Flinders. We went to town to work. Bob went to work in the market. Things didn't work out too good. I had 4 kiddies. Came back up here on my own, and now they're all laughing at me over there. And Mum would mind the kiddies. The youngest one was only 9 months old. Mum would mind, and I'd pick strawberries up at Patterson's, Bobby East's too, and then come home from the orchard and worked on the orchard. And then when I was 43, I went to work at Melbourne Nursing Home. There for 4 years, and then I went to Harnoff Nursing Home for another 19. Did night shift for about 17 years. Come home and, first of all I shifted to Woodside and Jacaranda. That was a nice place. And then I went down the village where I am now. Then I knocked off work and I started helping with Meals on Wheels. Well, I've just been finished that a year, and just playing around now, that's all. Going to Prides and CWA. Yeah, so that's my story. I'm 78 too.
I don't think I'll stand up, thank you, because I might fall over. I'm Mary Fry, and I lived up here until I was about 19, I think, and then I went and bought it in town. And I first worked at the Adelaide Co-op, and I was there till after I got married. I married a truckie from New South Wales, and I had 4 children after a long time. And what else did I do? I've got a very cheeky daughter down there that's talking behind her hand. And then I brought up 4 children of my own, and I worked a few jobs, all sorts of jobs to feed them. And then, what did I do?
One of the things we did want to know, Mary, is Peterson's old house up there where you grew up.
Yeah.
Can you describe what that house was like? Because now all we see is a ruin with a tree on top of it. But that's a very old Pease cottage that is actually heritage listed. Can you describe a little bit about what that was like when you were a kid?
It wasn't very nice, I can tell you that. It wasn't, it was pretty horrible. And it had a habit of leaking. And so Dad rendered the sides of it with cement to stop, because it was quite damp. And so how it ever got on the heritage list, I'll never know, because it wasn't what it was supposed to be, because it had cement sides on it. But it was just a horrible old house. Like some of them were there. And when I was about 18, I think Dad built the new one up the side, up the road a bit. And that was all right. That had the mod cons for those days in it. But the old one, why it was in the heritage list, I'll never know. Because
So you lived in the old...
And now the pine tree's fallen down through the middle of it. And so I don't know how you could do anything to it. You know, and I suppose it's still heritage listed.
Yeah, it is. So you lived in the old one until you were a teenager?
Yeah, so I was about 18 when Dad built that new house. And we never really had, we did have electricity a little time in the old one. But we never had any electricity up there. We were just in the middle of Basket Range and Lodenthorpe. Well, I don't think you did Lenswood either, did you?
So that sort of raises that next question. We always think that the history is lovely because they got stuff like we've got, like electricity, running water, toilets inside, bitumen roads. None of the above.
No, you had to go down half a mile down the garden to go to the toilet.
And that wasn't a septic system then either.
No.
It was a
drop.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I must make an apology to the meeting because I forgot to say that Mary is a great-great-grandchild of John Brock Fry. And I'll tell you a little story about John Brock Fry. He's always termed John Brock Fry, that's his full name. But he used to take a church service under a gum tree where the Lenswood Cold Stores is now. On a Sunday morning, anybody that wanted to go to church would go. It was non-denomination, but it was a church service. And every Sunday afternoon, John Brock Fry would put on a black frock coat, a peaked hat, and he had a staff with a silver top on it, and he took his dog Bowsy with him, and he walked 4 miles to Woodside to the Presbyterian Church every Sunday afternoon. And Bowsy's dog would sit under the stool, under the pew in the church, and they had a different clergyman there one day, and he said, I won't go on the service while there's a dog in the church. But John Brock Fry showed his character. He stood up, got his hat in his hand and his staff, and he said, come on, Bowsy. He said, no Bowsy, no John, and started to walk out. And 2/3 of the congregation got up to walk out with him. So the clergyman really changed his mind because he hadn't taken up the collection.
Mr. Chair, I just want a little story I should tell you. You mentioned how things have changed. Well, in the early days, we still had remote control. You people went your wonderful turn on the TV with a remote control. We had remote control way back many years ago, about 8 years ago. I remember my brother was walking to school with tuck shorts, and Archie Green, we used to plough the orchards in those days, and they used to have stuff first around the tree, had to put it as close as they can, and old Archie was walking around very intently with a single horse and a single furrow plough, getting as close as he could to the tree, and Archie and my brother Dudley and Tuck Shorts were walking past, and Tuck, he yells out, whoa. Well, the horse is always quite happy to stop there, and he stopped immediately, and Archie didn't stop, but he walked straight into the end of the handle of the plough, and it hurt him a bit really, and he looked around to see who'd done it. It was those kids going to school. So I'll get you, he said, and Archie Tuck just yells out, gee up, the horse goes off, and Archie goes to grab the shafts.
So Harvey, I'd like to go back to when you were saying about your father clearing the land, because we chopped the odd tree down, and it's bloody hard work, let alone to grub big old stringy barks and to get them down, then what do you do with them? Now that era must have had to work pretty hard to clear the land to what we have now. They didn't have bulldozers.
That's right. Well, there was, they had to use their brains a little bit. They get a big tree and they dig around it and hopefully it's lean enough to fall. They'd always put a log, I don't know how they drag it with a horse's face, put a log in front of the tree so that when the tree fell down the stump, it'd come right up out of the hole. Then they'd fill the hole in quick. And when they cut it up, of course the stump was on top of the ground. So yeah, that was right. And then later on, well actually my dad went down and worked on the Taylor Bend to Meningie Road, I think it was, to get a bit. He was down there for a little while to get a bit of cash, and that was mainly to buy gelignite. help get the trees out. So yeah, that's what he went to make the money. But later on he bought a tree puller, and we've still got it at home. It's quite a heritage thing. It's got a blade on it, quite thick, a bit like it looks a bit like the same as a circular saw, and it had two arms on it that pulled the teeth around like that and wound the cable up. And imagine through my shoulders you had a number like something like a 2-inch pipe, a long piece of pipe, and that wriggled it like this, you see, to pull that around like that. And you could put the pins in different places to hear it, and even out on the end of the pipe you had to get up a fair bit of steam to wind the cable up. Yeah.
So when the trees were down, did they use the timber for anything? Did they for firewood like we would now, or burn it? Or?
Yeah, they used to sell quite a bit to the bakeries around town, but otherwise, to get rid of the bulk of it, they'd boil it up.
But to be bakeries, you'd still have to chop it up into...
Chop it up into... Well, I think the bakeries used to take more like 3 foot, but same as So, yeah, and Dad wasn't too bad on the axe, and actually he did a bit of chopping just for fun. I think there was a centenary or something, or no, not a centenary, some sort of an open day to clear the forest range over to in the early days, and one of the events there was log chopping, and Dad just went along with the axe that he'd been using all the week and cleaned the shower. Yeah, and to say he wasn't too bad on the axe, there was a fella used to come up with his trolley from town for 4 foot sometimes, later on, and Dad would say, well, I haven't got any cut, but come on down the paddock. So as quick as he'd cut it, the fella would load it up, and then he'd take half a load up and put on the bank up on the road. Dad would go and cut, by the time he'd come back he had another half of the load cut, so he'd help him load it up and send him away, and he'd go away with his load of 4 foot. But you know, I tell you something about the old house up there.
Yes.
Well, Jim used to have a lot of chooks, and we used to go up there sometimes to get some eggs off him, and Jim had a lot of old stories. I think he's quite a contribution in the stringing parts to orchards from Jim, but he always had a lot of stories. But anyway, the old house that had a slab place out the back where the bathroom was, wasn't it?
Yeah, or the kitchen, had a kitchen out the back.
But anyway, out the back, and anyway, Jim went to sleep in the bath one night, but he got woke up because a rat fell off the raft and landed on his tummy.
Getting back to the felling of the large trees, of which there were plenty, my dad had one of those digger winches that,
those little fun.
that Harlan was talking about. You found a good hefty tree to anchor it to, ran out 40 or 50 metres of cable, got it up high into the tree you wanted to pull over, and with much groaning, eventually pulled the tree over. A lot of that when he was clearing the place, and that stood him in good stead, because in 1942, when he decided to build a cold store, it was during the war, and building materials were like hen's teeth, but the management of the Land and Brickworks decided, because he'd supplied them so much furnace wood in the past, if he could get a supply of wood and supply them with 4 foot wood for their kilns, for every truckload of kiln wood that he provided, they would sell him a truckload of bricks. And that's how he got the bricks to build his cold store, which the Greens are still using down there, in 1942. He'd run out of his own timber by then, but he did a deal with Mrs. Jones and went through the fence and cut timber out of her property to do that job. And later on, when we had Italian prisoners of war working on the place during the war, if they got a bit quiet and didn't have any spades to dig or onions to plant, he'd take the Italians through into Jones's and cut down a bit more 4 foot wood. pretty hard work in those
So
days.
men were men, weren't they? Men were men back then.
Women were women.
Yeah.
And women were women also.
And the three girls up the back are probably just like they were at school, up the back, if they're like their daughters. So what was school life like back then? I remember the flip-up chairs and the inkwells, and it was based on reading, writing and arithmetic. Whereas now I think they have computers and, well, we had slide rules. Probably most people don't know what slide rules are now. So what was
Fortunately,
school
they were
like?
short-lived.
Probably had to do a pretty good job with your work at school.
We had to sit and do this writing, page after page after page, cursive, yeah, so that you could actually write and you could read it.
And you could copy the one in front of them.
Yeah.
Copy the side of the book and do it the
And
same.
was that with ink?
Inkwells. Which some people used to put the girls' plats in the bottom of the inkwell.
Ah, never.
So did any of you have John Rock Fry teaching you, or was he finished by then?
He was probably finished by their parents too.
So he was way back.
We had Walter Ashley, Miss Campbell and Miss McCabe.
Yeah, that's right.
And were they good teachers?
Oh, wonderful.
Excellent.
I wasn't much a student, but they were good teachers.
So when we had the school, it was just the main building then.
Yes.
Three rooms. Yeah, well, one had a petition.
What was the other part? Didn't the teachers live in the, did they live in the
Not
school
any
building?
day.
No, there was rooms there. They used to be down underneath.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, the library.
Victoria.
Victoria daycare.
That was Mr. Tribe, I think, that lived in there. He was
And back in that era, when you look around, I think some of the school photos, there was a swag of kids.
yeah.
It was always like
130 and 1900.
Well, even in our day, there was generally about 100 or just over kids at school with
I think we
three
got up
pictures.
to 180 about when my dad and mum was going. And then it dropped back to my day about 126. And then it kept dropping back till it was down to, when our kids was going there about 80, got down to about 29 and it
Yeah,
was going to
29.
close.
And to see the numbers are going back up there with the influx, which is, really good for the community to
And
have a
there's
strong school.
kids coming in from the outside distance. 'Cause it's
And it's always had a good reputation of being a good school. Good teachers have taught the kids that wanted to work.
Looks like it's produced.
We're going to have a bigger day in October where we do something similar. But this is sort of laying a bit of a grounding on what we can expect. It's a, what's the word? I think you guys are not going to pass away between now and then. So hopefully we can have you back again. We're going to try and target a few more things like the sports. When we could talk this subject for a long time.
Why did Lenswood break away from Forest Range?
It didn't. Lenswood was part of Forest Range in the early days.
That's what I meant.
Well, Brian could tell you.
The history of Lenswood, Forest Range was a big district once and it had one post office right up in Forest Range by the Oval. And from the school at Lenswood, it was called Forest School, not Lenswood School in those days. And two boys were detailed to go up to the post office and get the mail in a sugar bag each day and take the letters that had to be posted and bring the letters and the mails back. Two boys went and of course they got away with nearly 2 lessons by the time they do it all up there and back. That was a marvellous thing to be a post boy. But in 1917, my grandfather John Vickers called a public meeting in the eastern part of Forest Range and they decided they'd apply for another post office. And that's how we got 2 post offices in Forest Range. And then they had a further meeting of people to bring in names that could be called. I won't bore you with all the names that came in, but at that stage in 1917 there was a big battle at Lens in the northern France, and we still had a lot of stringy bark forests that these men are telling you about how they cleared them. And so they called it Lenswood. That was was 1917. That's how Lenswood got a post office. And then in 1927, 10 years after that, my father called a meeting and my Uncle Max was secretary, and they got a telephone exchange in Lenswood in 1927. That's the history of Lenswood.
And I remember when those first telephone directories came out, each individual exchange had its own listing in the phone book, not like it is alphabetically today. But a very early one, I remember counting up, there were 28 greens listed under the Lenswood Telephone Exchange, their numbers.
There's still a force to be reckoned with, even though
Not associated with the parliamentary greens either.
that's right.
And then Mrs. Fountain started the post office,
So
didn't
that-
she?
But,
Mrs. Fountain started it. the post office.
no.
So I've just had
Didn't she?
I've just had a little clip from Colin Fry here, Brian. Colin's just had a comment about the
Mrs.
Greens.
Fountain started the telephone exchange. Yes, but not the post office.
Oh,
The post office was started by Mrs. John Brock Fry. And the postal things used to come up to Belhannah, then by horse they went to Birdwood, horse and cart. And each morning, Polly John Brock Fry, that was a daughter of John Brock Fry's, would go with a horse and cart to Loberthal and get the Forest Range letters and bring out. And then when they opened the post office officially, it was in a shed, a prefab shed on Rogers' property behind the Lenswood School, just where the oval is now. And Polly ran it for some time, and then I forget the next one.
Eggleton's. So it was round at Eggleton's, where JB Fry
I forget who they
Jr.
were now, but eventually Mrs. Bird, as she was, her husband died with TB, and she was a widow, and she took over the post office up there. And then when her husband died, her brothers built a house for her at the top of Swan Road, and that's where the post office was. And eventually she married a gentleman in Mount Torrens called Fountain.
yeah, but,
She ended up Mrs. Fountain.
but before that, a lot of the town people gave 20 cents a week, didn't
And
they?
Tom
To keep
Leaney
them
built
going.
the shop at Lenswood. It's called the Four Square Shop then, I think. And with the next person that took that over, Mrs. Fountain gave postal and telephone away, and well, it became automatic by then. But gave the post away to the store at Lenswood.
But they did used to give her so much a week when he first died.
Oh, that's a big story, I won't go into it. Well, I'll just tell you part of that story of the Forest Range Post Office, because James Gillett Collins started the property where Vickers started in Lenswood, went to Mount Torrens, and he lasted a year or two there. He left two sons there in grazing, and he came back to Forest Range, and he built a slab house there, slab office, and that became a post office. And one of his unmarried daughters became postmistress there, and she was getting 15 shillings a year to be postmaster at Forest Range. And one day she said to the inspector, could she have some more money? And the postmaster said, Miss Collins, you're getting 15 shillings a year, you could buy a new bonnet with that. And she said that I can't walk around with just a bonnet on.
Okay. So thank you very much for coming in, and thank you especially to our group up the front.